I'm curious where you stand on the GA4 adventure.
It's still very love and hate of GA4, unfortunately. I think after Brighton SEO, I've been able to um, appreciate a little bit more just because now I know I have a better understanding of where to find certain reports and stuff like that. So now where we used to have four reports, we actually can pull seven if we do different iterations and stuff like that. And I didn't realize that was actually something that was plausible because I mean, when we open up GA4, it's nothing like what UA used to be. And that is already kind of disappointing in itself. So then naturally you don't really want to learn you don't want to learn more, right? So for me, that was very much it where I was like, I don't want to learn this thing. But knowing that now we have no choice, right? And understanding that Google kind of really had no choice in terms of that launch as well on, I think it was this year, actually July 1st of this year. Um, it helps me kind of find a little bit of patience because I'm like, okay, this wasn't really their choice. They wanted to release this 2 years in the future. This was supposed to be 2025. It's just that everything that's happening in Europe in regards to all of their lawsuits and stuff like that really forced them to push like they didn't have a choice, right? They had to launch a half-finished product.
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the E-Marketing Association Power Marketing podcasts. Here's Kevin.
I'm super excited to be chatting with Ameet Khabra today because started in search many, many years ago, and that's the area where she works. So I'd love to start with sort of your journey into paid search and sort of how you ended up managing paid search and doing Hipscop Media.
It's quite the story, I feel. A little long, but I think thrilling. I don't know if anybody else will agree with it, but I personally think it was a thrilling story. I started my first company at 19, actually. So in event planning, I used to volunteer. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. So I started volunteering with random organizations, realized I really enjoyed it in the event planning space. So decided to go off and do my own thing. And at that time, I was the youngest organizer in that specific industry. I ran the youngest team. We were all volunteers outside of like basically me at that point. And considering that I didn't really get paid, I was also a volunteer. So it kind of worked itself out. But we ran that for about 3 years. And eventually I just got really tired of it. But in between all of it, I was in school for business administration with a minor in entrepreneurial leadership, realized that I hated macro and microeconomics, could not understand it as much as I tried. Like it didn't make any sense to me. And I remember I talked to the professors about it. I'm like, can you break this down in a way that I could understand it? And they would try, and it just like it for whatever reason it didn't compute. So eventually I looked at all my credits and went, which program does this go? Like the most credits, where do they go? And it was marketing management. So I was like, I guess I'm in marketing management now. And that was basically like that's the origin story of me just going, okay, let's try it. And thankfully we had a class on computer sciences, and it was just one class, 3 hours long. And I remember this day like it was yesterday for whatever odd reason. It was an afternoon, like an evening class. So it was dark outside. We were sitting in the computer room, and my professor at the time, Dan, was talking about Google Ads, analytics, Facebook advertising, email marketing, social media, like everything that we do as specialties now. It was a 3 hour class. And for whatever reason, I wrote Google Ads and analytics down. I don't know why. It just happened to happen. And then a year later, I ended up leaving like that company and just kind of closing up shop. And in between all of that, I started running ads, but it wasn't like something that I was like super duper passionate about. It was just, let's see if we can sell tickets. And that was kind of really the thought process. So when I had closed up the company, I decided to leave British Columbia, where I was raised, and move to Alberta. And for whatever reason, again, I was sitting there one night just looking at this empty book going, what do I do? Like, what's my career path? What am I doing with all of this? I've moved to now a new province where I know nobody. What am I doing here was really the question. And I opened up this notebook and it said Google Ads and Analytics. It was my old like notebook from school. And I was like, let's try that again. So I got certified, and literally like 2 weeks, maybe several days, I get an email from a company going, "Hey, you have the credentials we're looking for." And at that time, I was like, "What, being certified? Like that's literally the only experience I really truly have outside of like spending maybe like $6,000 a year. Like that's not really experience in my eyes, really. I mean, now it isn't, but I guess at that time it was." So I walked into an interview, and he was like, "Yeah, do you want to start tomorrow?" And I went, "Okay, like why not?" So I went from spending $6,000 a year to 4.3 million basically overnight, it felt like. And they just gave me the reins. They were like, "Figure it out," kind of thing. And thankfully for them, they got very, very lucky. They got somebody who's obsessive like I am. So for me, I was like, I need to do my job, and I need to do it really, 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 really well. So I started finding like community forums, blog posts, started blogging myself as well at one point just to help my own understanding. And all of a sudden, all these random things started to pick up. And I was like, "Oh, cool." So Google, I think like at that time, we were still on Google Streams for the Google partner community. So they used to do spotlights on community members and stuff like that. So within 4 months, they were like, "Well, you've been doing a really good job. We'd love to spotlight you." And I was like, "Cool." And then 2 months after that, they're like, "You want to become an ambassador for us?" I'm like, "Yes, of course I do." And then it just kind of kept on going. And then eventually I left that company because I really wanted to close that loop where I'm like, I don't want to send the lead. I want to know what happens afterwards. I really want to be involved with like the aftermath. And at this company, I wasn't able to do that. So I left and thought going to an agency would help me do that. And I very quickly learned that that's not the case. But I got to round out my skill set. I got to learn more about SEO, more about social, more about email. So then after a year later, I kind of sat there and went, I kind of want to freelance. I don't really want to be here anymore because like I think every agency is obviously different, but the agency that I was at was very focused on how many hours you were billable, not necessarily what impact you made for the client. And that had never really sat well with me. So then eventually at some point, it kind of got to a point where I was like, I'd rather leave and start new and have one client that might pay me $500 a month, but at least I care. Like at least we're really looking at what we're doing for them. So I went and did that. And then what followed is hop skip media, basically some haphazard way of getting here by freelancing and stuff like that. So yeah, that's the long-winded origin story of Ameet Khabra.
Yeah, well, that's a great origin story. What's interesting is, I got to take economics, both micro and macro, twice because I took it as an econ major undergrad, and then I took it again in grad school at Yale. Mm-hmm. And for me, sort of being a marketing mad scientist, I was able to actually use a lot of the microeconomics theory because we actually built the bid management platform and did its early generation, before mm-hmm. Marin sort of took all the margin out of that business. And so, understanding marginal elasticity became extremely useful in understanding the cause and effect of changing bids and whether or not the ecosystem at large would let you keep changes in position, or if it was an extremely inelastic, meaning the only person who was happy was Google because they made more money. And then building the mm-hmm. algorithms around understanding, well, where do you find the places where you can push the envelope and where you can't? It was useful to sort of think through, marginal elasticity of ecosystems mm-hmm. and go back to, economics. And the other, fun part of econ that I enjoyed applying is really thinking through every marketing touch point and understanding its marginal impact and interaction effects between other media types, right? I mean, in paid search, what's really fun is we can almost tell when other forms of marketing are being done because we see surges and spikes in brand search traffic in particular, but even sometimes non-branded. And so, to some extent, search data can be a leading indicator of other forms of marketing that are working. So it's super, super fun to have having had done that. When you were at Brighton at the SEO conference, you spoke on paid search. So what was the topic of your session?
My topic was on Performance Max. So the title, it came from my junior. So he gets the credit for this one. I've just been running with it for a year and a half now, but it's going from PMET to PMAX. I love the title so much. I really love the title. Makes me laugh every single time. Everybody loves it. But yeah, so it was basically really just talking about Performance Max, but also the role of AI in Performance Max, and then how to kind of just start Performance Max on the right foot, because I feel like a lot of people aren't doing that, and that's why there's such a negative sentiment towards it. And admittedly, like, we're not perfect. I've started campaigns that probably shouldn't have started in Performance Max, but I was like, let's launch it, let's see what happens. And it was kind of a little bit of a testing period. But now, after learning and seeing what everybody else has gone through, and then also what we've gone through, the presentation was mainly just a culmination of how to start off really well, or how to continue to do well with it.
Right, right. Well, one fun thing about conferences is that regardless of whether one is speaking or not, there's a lot of learning going on. So when I speak at conferences, I'm always as happy as what I learned from others as what I taught others. Were there any other things that you sort of took away from the conference where you were like, wow, I never thought of that, or I'd forgotten about that, and I'm so glad that this person reminded me or taught me this?
Yeah, I think Susan, she presented right before I had, during our, I guess, our track or whatever they're called. And she had talked about like isolating certain metrics or components in a campaign, I guess. Is actually components is the word for it. Where she was like, if we have these four options: geographic, device, whether or not we're using branded or something along those lines. She's like, for her, it was which ones are the non-negotiables, and then which ones can we just go like completely crazy with. And I think that really kind of reframed the way that I look at things a little bit. So I was like, I usually go with what are all the non-negotiable, like nothing is negotiable. And I realize that that's probably not necessarily the correct approach to use, even though I don't trust Google as much as I feel like she trusts Google. So I think that was kind of one of those moments where I was like, okay, like, we could break this up in a way and actually possibly yield better results if we actually start looking at certain things and going, you know what, we could actually be a little bit more flexible here versus being so like very strict with stuff. So I'm really excited to kind of start implementing that. And then also she really encouraged broad match with audience signals instead, and just letting it do its thing. I've tossed and turned that idea quite a bit. Broad match, I mean, I think we all have our own opinion about broad match, and they're relatively similar. So that's the reason why I just kind of haven't really gone down that path. But there's a couple accounts that I feel like we're in a good state where we could possibly do that. So that, I think that'll be something that I'll be looking into probably at the start of next year, just because we're at the tail end of this year and I don't really want to be messing with too much, especially with the holiday season coming right around the corner.
Sure, sure. Well, one of the fun things is, when you're not sure if one of those other targeting levers is super material or not, or whether, it will allow you to drive more clicks at a good, KPI, is, you sort of keep the old one and sort of semi-clone the campaign, but, start to just play with the ones that you want to play with. From an account structure perspective, my team certainly found that getting the right account structures can make a huge difference for that, and allowing you to sort of run a hypothesis around that. And they like to do it that way rather than, campaign experiments within Google, because sometimes, it seems like it's a little fuzzy as to exactly the cause and effect sometimes. So
yeah, and then able to get enough data on that front too, right? Because you're kind of splitting your traffic at the other point. You're just like, was that really the right decision? Was it not? So it kind of boils down to what size of clients you're working with as well. So like, yes, experiments within Google Ads is underutilized, but at the same time, like, how big are these accounts? Because if a client's spending $500, maybe even $1,000, like, that's not really a lot of money to sit there and be like, yeah, let's do experiment. Let's siphon off 25% and like do an experiment. That you're not going to yield anything. You'll be sitting there for 6 months waiting for enough data to be like statistically significant. So at that point, I have to really go back and be like, okay, yes, we can talk about how it's underutilized, but like, we also have to consider budgets are also a massive factor in all of this. So yeah, if anybody's sitting around thinking, oh, I need to do experiments, if you're siphoning off 25% of your budget, and that's a significant amount of money, just doing it within the account and just trying to figure it out as you go through is probably the best bet, or at least that's how I've always seen it.
Right. Well, I know my team and I have had an opportunity to do a ton of PPC account audits, and probably you have as well. Often it's part of the business development process as well. And I'm curious what mistakes you see a lot.
Oh gosh, so many. that like I feel like that question is just like opening a can of worms really at that point. You're just like you find one thing and then you go find another and you find another. Conversion tracking is the bane of my existence. It's the one thing that I love, and it's also the one thing that brings me so much pain because of other people. So it's like one of those moments where I'm like, okay, I love auditing because I know exactly what I'm going to end up finding usually, and it's bad conversion tracking. Recently, we did actually an audit. We completed it, I think, last week. And the conversion tracking was on clicks and some were on page views. So then suddenly the client's sitting there looking at it going, oh, we're getting thousands of conversions. And I'm like, but I don't think you are. There's no evidence to support that right now. Your agency is just telling you that this is correct when it really truly isn't. And I can understand there's limitations with platforms. Sometimes you can't really fully get that full view of where that conversion actually really happened, especially if you're using a third-party booking tools or something like that. But there's ways that we can get creative and figure it out. And I really wish more agencies were willing to do that, or at least the ones that we're currently auditing. I wish those agencies were willing to do that. So conversion tracking is probably like the number one. Like anytime I see page views as a conversion point, like it breaks my heart in a way that I cannot explain. And I think only fellow like paid search people or paid advertising, I should say, would actually understand like that pain, because you're just like, we're in 2024 almost. How are we still doing this? Like, that was number one when I started in 09, I think was when I actually fully started learning ads, and that was like cardinal rule number one: do not do page views. You're not supposed to be doing this. So seeing that it's still a thing 14 and a half years later, like it really hurts. It really does truly hurt. And then also not using like location exclusions and stuff like that, or actually not even properly using location targeting. So oftentimes we'll sit there and be like, oh, there's like clicks from India, but we're a Canadian company. And I was like, did no one ever connect those dots at one point and been like, why are we spending so much money and not getting enough conversions? Like, why is their CPA so high? Like these random little things where my mind initially goes like right here every single time. Or sometimes conversion tracking is just simply not there, and it might be the agency didn't do it, but sometimes it's, how many times have we gone to sleep and woken up to find out that our client has redeveloped their website without telling us? Like, and now there's no conversion tracking, there's no nothing. So then these agencies just keep on going, where the moment I see like a tiny dip and I'm like, did they change conversion tracking? Because it's not, I never go with how did we mess up? I go with how did the client screw us over? Like, and it always, every single time it works out, because it's just naturally something that they end up doing. They just don't think about it, right? And I mean, who would at this point? So I can't really blame them, but it really hurts. Conversion tracking is the one thing I could probably talk about all day and just talk about my heartbroken sentiments towards it, because it's just not something that's utilized enough. And when it is utilized, it's not utilized the way that it should be. And a lot of headache could be solved if we just implemented conversion tracking right the first time. So if you're unable to do it, then invest in somebody else doing it. It's worth that money. It truly is worth that money. It will pay you back 10 times, if not 20, 30, 40 times.
Yeah, I mean, it's gotten worse, right? Because if you're going to be using Performance Max and it's going to be basing its decisions based on bad conversion tracking or partially implemented or double counting, which we've seen a bunch of times, obviously it's going to be doing the wrong thing because it's getting bad data in order to make its decisions. So I would agree with you. That one's pretty common. The other one, I guess, just we see a lot of, and it manifests itself differently into different levels of horribleness. Is just really, really bad account structures. We see that a lot. And what's good
improper use of like
and I is that, there are a lot of folks out there who clearly do not know how to do this, despite perhaps having gotten a Google certification, which, as you indicated, wasn't so hard to get. It doesn't really mean all that much. Luckily, in your case, there was a whole lot more intellect behind there to get you to the finish line.
Thankfully. But like now, if you were to ask me if I do those Google certification exams, like I will wholehearted, like I have no problems with telling people that I cheat on that exam now. Like I did it the first couple of times the way that I was supposed to do it. I passed the way that I was supposed to pass. I know that I know my stuff now. I don't have 90 minutes times 7 exams or whatever, how many there are now, to sit here and do this. And like now, especially with the proctoring that's going to be happening, I was like, I'm not doing that exam ever again. Like, there's no way I'm going to make it through without cheating and being able to do it in 20 minutes, because like we just don't have that kind of time anymore, where we want to be managing our accounts. And frankly, for an exam that basically just wants us to be like smart bidding, use automation, like we already know that. So I feel I'm a little scared for the next generation of people who are going to be like, yeah, I did the exam, now I should be able to get a job. And I'm like, that's actually not a clear indicator that you actually know what you're doing now. Like, I have to really have those conversations with people now, where I'm like, I love that you did the exam, I love that you spent that time on the exam, but I'm like, all of it, okay, like 80% of it doesn't apply. Like all of it's just basically telling us to use automation, and that's just not, we don't want to be doing like those auto recommendations. Like, that's the worst thing to find in an account audit. Like, I want to walk into a wall basically at that point and just like hit my head against it and just be like, why did this happen? How did this happen? And those are easy fixes to make. So a lot of the mistakes that really happen in an account that really hurt my heart are the really basic ones. So like the auto recommendations, not having conversion tracking in, broad match literally everywhere with no negative keyword lists. Like, what did you think was going to happen? Like, I just have to really go back and be like, what did you think was going to happen?
Yeah. Well, the word think probably is the key word there. There maybe not a lot of thinking. But let's go back to Performance Max, because it was the topic of your session, and it has evolved a lot over the years. I remember first generation of Performance Max was quite horrible, and I think they probably should have baked it a little bit more before they released it, because I think a lot of folks in the industry were turned off by it, and it has improved a lot. So, any tips as to when to deploy and how to deploy properly to increase your chances of making it really, hum?
Yeah, I think the one thing that a lot of people have a tendency to forget with Performance Max is that we believe that it's just like this magic box and that we are supposed to set it and forget it. Nothing in digital marketing should ever be set it and forget it. And I will be screaming that for the rest of my life, or rest of my career at this point. It needs constant work. Just because we put in the headlines, we put in the descriptions, we put in the images and the videos, does not mean that our job is over. We need to continue making iterations. And we also need to update that graphic content and all that text content and all of that stuff. Because again, we're making signals saying, hey, like, we're updating things. There's new content to be pushed out. We're actually actively watching it. And I think that's really where the biggest mistake kind of comes in, especially for campaigns, when we start seeing it go down that downward spiral and we're like, what the heck just happened? Well, one, we're not actively looking at the account. So now we can't see when that downward trend is about to start, and we can possibly stop it with corrective actions. But then we're also losing opportunities. What if we start seeing a little bit of a dip, not a dip, but like an increase upwards? Maybe there's something in there that'll tell us that we need to actually amplify our efforts, and we can actually maybe 10x our numbers versus like the 2x that we would do if we just let it run. There's a lot of random little things like that. So setting and forgetting it is like the big thing that I really need everybody to understand. Do not do that anymore. It is not going to yield great results. But then the other half is understanding that Performance Max isn't able to collect data just by like you giving it two pieces of information. Like, it really needs you to give it information. When we say data, I mean like literally everything: audience signals, custom lists, search themes, CRM integration. If you're on ecom, I want to see that obviously a data feed in there and that it's cleaned up really, really well. Value-based bidding, we want to make sure that we're doing that, remarketing and stuff like that. So like, it really depends whether you're lead gen or if you're ecom, but first and foremost, just understanding that you need to give it as much information as you possibly can, because this is AI again, right? So if we're using it, I think a great example of it is like when we're using it for writing copy or something like that. We'll sit there and actually be like, this is the client's URL. This is their target audience. This is what they do really well. Here are their taglines. We give it so much information that when it outputs, the editing isn't as much as if we were to just say, here's the URL and call it a day, right? So we have to really take that same approach with Performance Max, where we're just constantly adding in more information as we can, because AI's like the AI in Performance Max, what it's meant to do is to find patterns and then to optimize. So the more information that it has, the better that it's able to do that. And especially on the e-com side with the CRM integration, it'll be able to sit back and forth and be like, okay, that was a good lead and that was a bad lead. Because we have that whole, I think it was Scott Redgate. I don't remember who he quoted it off from, but Scott had created like this feedback loop of doom type of graphic. And it was like, You launch Performance Max, it goes out into the world, a bot will crawl it, which naturally happens, it'll convert, and then Google will sit there and be like, hey, we did our job. We're going to go spend more money and we're going to go off and do all these amazing things. And then all of a sudden there's more invalid clicks, there's more bots, there's more conversions, and everybody goes, oh, we're getting these really, really horrible leads. Well, if you're not feeding that back into Google saying, hey, we don't want these leads, it's going to keep on doing that for us, right? And that's where that set it and forget it part has to really kind of like needs to go, because the moment we do that, obviously all we're going to get is bot traffic. So we had that issue with one of our clients, and we tried to get that CRM integration in there, and he just like couldn't make it work. So eventually at one point I was like, okay, I guess we're going to ditch it. And he kind of sat there and he's like, but all of these leads, I'm like, but these are not closing. So I'm like, we're wasting money at this point. I'm like, I understand that you see conversion numbers, but I'm like, I see $0. So I'm going to take it out. If we can't get that CRM integration in and we can't get that feedback loop in, there's no point. Because the moment we end up in that feedback loop of doom, it's really, really hard to get out of it, right? You basically have to start all over again and be like, okay, well, I gave you all of this horrible data. Now you're going to have this horrible data with a little bit of good data. That's not a good mix.
Yeah.
It'll never be a good mix. Sometimes you have to start all over. And a lot of people don't really realize that. They'll try to just start all over within that Performance Max campaign. And I'm like, unfortunately, this is a moment of like, delete, let's move back on and do it again, which sucks, but it is what it is.
Yeah, the other thing that we don't feel like Performance Max is quite there yet is when there's significant differences between the average customer and the best customer from an LTV perspective. It takes a while for LTV data to accumulate. So
and especially on the e-com side, it's going to naturally go for the higher AOV than the lower ones, and you never really know that like the lower might be the higher profit, and you're like, no, go here.
Well, not even higher immediate profit, higher long-term profit in particular, right? So there may be certain types of products carried by a retailer or by DTC that are that act as a loss leader, right, from an initial perspective, but are the perfect customer long-term because they reorder a lot, or they just end up really loving the brand as a result of being in a particular geography or a particular device type or whatever it is. And unless you reflect that information back into the bidding algorithm intelligently, the bidding algorithm is not going to be taking that into account, making its bidding decisions. I mean,
and I think that's where a lot of people seem to think that Google has all this wealth of data, and it 100% does, but like, it's still a 5-year-old. We still have to tell it what we want it to do. We still need to give it, like, I liken it to like basically my 4-year-old nephew. I'm not going to sit there and give him a bag of Skittles and be like, do whatever you want with it. Like, I'm going to sit there and give it to him one by one, explain why I'm giving it to him one by one, because at that point he might just put his fist in and just shove the entire thing in his mouth and then run rampant. And that's basically what we're doing with Performance Max when we leave it, when we're not giving it the information that needs to be given, or we're leaving it on a set it, forget it type of method. It's basically unleashing a 4-year-old with a sugar high onto the world. And at that point, like, nothing good is ever going to come from that. Like, I'm going to be chasing that kid in that mall for an hour and a half, just trying to get him back. And then at that point, you're going to have a temper tantrum. And that's what Performance Max has been, at least for me, when every time that I've sat there and been like, yeah, you could set it and forget it and find that out. And 2 years ago, I wish I kind of had that little analogy in my head where I'd be like, no, don't treat it like your nephew. It's not the same.
Yeah. You had mentioned where you had a client who could actually get their back end CRM attached in, and as a result it was obviously making decisions on leading indicators, which were actually not tied directly to revenue. They may have been proportional to revenue, but they weren't, and therefore those nuances were lost. And I still am amazed when I come across a medium to large advertiser who really sort of missing a lot of the back-end intelligence information that allows one to really understand that additional level of nuance. So obviously in that case you may not have been able to resolve the situation. They just perhaps couldn't get the platforms to talk to each other. But if you want to do that without creating a freak out moment for the client, because they have been making decisions based on a precursor kind of data set, not the one they're not the right KPIs. How do you usually approach that so without freaking them out? Like, let's deconstruct your business and really think about what we want to optimize around long term.
I think really the education is really a big part. So kind of going back to like the reason why I left the agency in the first place was that I really wanted to focus on education. Like I had started a blog on my own. I had asked them to send me to conferences to possibly speak or just learn. That was not something that everybody else in the agency was doing at that time. I was very specifically brought to that agency to like develop out their PPC department. So for me, it was very, very important to like make sure that clients understood what we were doing for them. Because I'm like, at the end of the day, they're giving us 10, 20, 30, 40, 50K a month. Shouldn't we be telling them what we're doing? Like me reporting on how many website visitors is not important. Like, I just don't think it's, somebody might disagree with me, but I personally do not think it's important. Like I literally, my reports, like I was the most annoying person at that agency. My reports were about like literally a paragraph long. And like, it would be like, I 13x your money. I 20x your money. I 5x your money. And that was the report. To a point where like management would be like, what the hell is this? And on my report, I told them how much I made. That is all they need to know. Like, frankly, that is really all they need. They don't need to know what the bounce rate was. They don't need to know how long somebody stayed on the site. They need to know how much money I made them. That is the only thing. And that's why there was a lot of friction with me and the agency, because it was just like, I don't agree with half of what you've done here. So really going back and like making education such a huge part of my agency was something that was really, really important to me. So spending that time and really being like, okay, but if we have this piece of information, if you do this hard work, not only is it going to benefit you, but it's going to benefit your ad campaign, which benefits us. And then we're all happy. And really kind of breaking that down for them is really, really, it's been really great, just because that way they kind of, it's less of a daunting task. We'll just start with something very small where we'll be like, pull all your products or your services and figure out what your profit margin is. Let's just start there, right? And then we move into like the more like, how many leads do you need to close this one? How many, like whatever else that needs to be part of our process. And that's what really, really helps, is them doing it slowly but surely, but also making sure that they understand why we're doing that. And usually that conversation happens in phone calls, not emails. Like it's usually it's an interactive conversation. It can't be an email of me going, hey, what are your profit margins? Because then at that point they're going, well, why am I telling you? Why should I tell you all of this? Why should I do this work, plain and simple? So when we're having that conversation, we're like, if we take our profit margins and we're able to sit there and be like, okay, this is how much money that we made, we can actually kind of make projections on like how much more money we can spend on this side to possibly really like actually potentially increase your profit margins to a certain degree, or well, not your profit margins, but your revenue. And that's been really, really helpful, because like the moment you talk to people, I think it's just a moment you talk to people at like their people, that's when they actually understand it. And I feel like a lot of agencies talk to their clients as if they're actually clients, and we don't. That's not our approach. I literally walk into a meeting sometimes like I'm known for showing up a minute late because I'm always doing something else halfway time. And it's usually with client work and stuff like that. And I'll be like, oh, damn, I'm running a minute late. And I'll jump in. And the first thing I'll be like, hello, friends. And they'll just sit there and be like, and I'm like, hi, what's going on? And they just come in really chipper and really, really happy all the time and act like it's not really a business meeting. It really brings their guard down. But like at the same time, I'm just not that person. I'm not like somebody who can walk into a room and be very rigid and like be like, let's discuss business. No, I want to know what your weekend was. I want to know if your kid actually made it through their soccer team, made it to like whatever finals you were telling me about like last month. And that really, really helps them wanting to like come back and actually do that work. So it makes it less daunting, because they're like, oh, we're just working with friends. And that's exactly what I want everybody to feel when they're working with our agencies, that they're working with people who give a shit, and also working with people that they really like. So then education, it's just me repeating myself. It's just education really becomes a lot easier when you break down a lot of the walls.
Yeah, and I think the one theme that I sense there is that's the way that you build the trust, to be able to ask the difficult questions about profit margin by SKU, and profit margin by subcategory, and maybe getting to LTV data that they may not even know if they have in their back end, right? But you have to sort of get them excited enough to go uncover it so that they can use it. So lots of fun stuff there.
Now, I've had like fights with clients before too. It's like pretty freaking, like we'll be yelling at each other and the next day we're like totally fine. And I was like, no other agency could ever do this. Like right. Nobody could have such a frank conversation and still keep that client. Like even a client of ours left and came back a year later and she's like, I missed arguing with you. And I was like, I love that, because I'm like, at least we made progress every single time we got into that argument, where she was like, they would just be like, okay. And that's the end of it. And she's like, our campaign tanked because there was nobody pushing back. saying,
Right.
no, we don't agree with this, we don't agree with that. So it makes it a lot easier to get the information that you want from your client when you actually are very willing to kind of stay where, like, draw your line and say, this is where I'm standing. I'm the analyst, I'm the expert. You need to listen to me. And that also helps with that trust side of things
Yep.
as well.
Yeah, sure. So GA4 is deployed, and people have sort of a love-hate relationship with it. There's some things about it that they like. There's a lot of things about it that they don't like. A lot of folks would like to be able to use GA4 as their single source of truth, but some people are getting a little skittish about perhaps having that be their North Star from a data and analytics perspective. So I'm curious where you stand on the GA4 adventure.
It's still very love and hate of GA4, unfortunately. I think after Brighton SEO, I've been able to appreciate a little bit more, just because now I know I have a better understanding of where to find certain reports and stuff like that. So now, where we used to have 4 reports, we actually can pull 7 if we do different iterations and stuff like that. And I didn't realize that was actually something that was plausible, because I mean, when we open up GA4, it's nothing like what UA used to be. And that is already kind of disappointing in itself. So then naturally, you don't really want to you don't want to learn more, right? So for me, that was very much it, where I was like, I don't want to learn this thing. But knowing that now we have no choice, right? And understanding that Google kind of really had no choice in terms of that launch as well. I think it was this year, actually, July 1st of this year. It helps me kind of find a little bit of patience, because I'm like, okay, this wasn't really their choice. They wanted to release this 2 years in the future. This was supposed to be 2025. It's just that everything that's happening in Europe in regards to all of their lawsuits and stuff like that really forced them to push. Like they didn't have a choice, right? They had to launch a half-finished product. So knowing that gives me hope that it'll actually become something that we will all love just as much as we loved UA. But I understand the sentiments right now. It's a little murky, and using it as a point of the source of all truth it's very hard. It's very hard for me to trust it right now. So I think it's really just taking that information, cross-referencing it through other reporting or other analytics and stuff like that, and just making sure that it's in a place where I want it to be. Is the biggest thing. I've been pretty happy with, like, the conversion tracking side of things. They've made it a little bit easier in terms of figuring out which ones we're actually tracking, which ones we aren't. Where in UA4, or not UA4, sorry, in UA, it was a little clunky, I found. But yeah, I feel my favorite report is like the page path, or not the page path, oh God, it's like
Funnel?
where you can see, the funnel path one. So finding that one's always really fun to figure out. I'm like, where is it again? I'm like, under advertising, or is it under here, or explore, or under reports? Like, just finding the information has been just increasingly harder. So for me, I love it because I know what it can become, full on knowing, understanding that, like, Google had no choice in terms of, like, pushing out a product that was half done. But I hate it because I can't find what I'm looking for still. So that's kind of it. Yeah, it's a love-hate still.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because obviously American marketers are thinking to ourselves, well, like, why should we suffer, right, as a result of Google having to decide that they're going to have a unified product globally, and so they have to build it to the lowest common denominator of acceptable data use, right? Which is very different in the EU than it is in the United States. But even obviously at a state level, there's a little bit of nuance now being added in with California and things like that. So there may be an opportunity for some other analytics out there. I'm sort of puttering around with some ideas now. So what has you excited about the next year?
Oh gosh. I think just really the evolution of these products. I really want to see what demand gen does. We just had that recently released. Search themes were recently released, and there hasn't been an official statement, but I've been reading little chatter that, like, custom lists and search terms are going out the door, and it's just going to be search themes. So really kind of trying to figure out what place custom lists and search terms had in the first place, if they're willing to throw it away so easily, has been really kind of going on in the back of my head, where I'm like,
it was only the power users using it, to be honest, from what I see.
Yeah.
and that if you sort of think about the Google advertiser ecosystem at large, what percentage of it was power users? You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah, that's
and
true.
given my entire team are power users, they get really annoyed when something is dropped just because not enough people were using it, right? As opposed to was it useful or useless isn't the criteria. It's was it being used, right?
That is totally fair. I never really thought about it that way. For me, I was just like, why are you throwing it away so easily for this other thing? So
Yeah,
then it was just one of those moments where I was like, I really need to think about this a little bit further because I'm
yeah,
like, something doesn't seem right quite here. But just seeing like the evolution of what that's actually going to look like is really, really exciting. And just seeing how Performance Max will evolve into whatever it's supposed to evolve into will be really cool. I think um, what I would really love to see is just like for Google to push the importance of CRM data into Performance Max a little bit more because that's not something that they've been doing at all.
for sure.
And I would love
Yeah.
for them to start pushing that and be like, you know what, we need to have this if we want to do a good job and we want like for themselves to be set up for success as well. Like this is going to make them more money if they help us succeed really at this point. Like the notion I don't really ever understand the logic that they've used for some of their reps and stuff like that because I'm like if you just simply told your reps to focus on that account and not necessarily like certain metrics we would be spending way more money because we would see the return back. Instead, you're going, hey, let's do broad match. Hey, let's put on auto recommendations. And I'm like, those are not goals that are going to make us want to spend more cash, right? Like that's just like it just feels backward. So I'm hoping that their customer support team gets a bit better next year. That's something that I'm hopefully looking forward to.
Yeah,
And
the
then
conspiracy
also seeing
theorist,
what,
the conspiracy theorist in me likens it to that there may be some folks within their ecosystem internally that sort of feel like, well, sometimes just to make it easier to drink, we have to water the vodka down, right? Because they'll buy it anyway. And
I guess so.
I hope that's not the case, but sometimes when they try to stick easy buttons in there just to make it easier for people to use who don't have the level of training and expertise that your team and my team have, we're like, but wait a minute, you originally gave us an F-19 and now we have to fly this thing, and you took half of the controls away. We're never going to win the war now, so
Yeah, and that's like basically what the new UI in Google Ads in itself. Like I keep on going back to the old version. I'm notorious for doing it until like literally the last moment that they force it upon me. And like I'm kind of curious. I'm not necessarily looking forward to it, but I'm kind of curious how that's going to change our way of working as well now. Because like I have not looked at it. I refuse. Like I flat out just at this point where I'm like, I want to stay in this one. I know it works. I need to get through my day. Like I don't have this kind of time to sit here and be like, let me figure this whole new UI out because like we just did it with G4. Like I'm still trying to figure out G4 and now you've put it into Google Ads. Like that's just a bit too much for me. So I'm curious as to when they're going to roll that out, but then also the other end of the generative AI that was just released in the US. Like 2024 is when all the other countries, so predominantly our clients are Canadian. So I want to see that roll out and see how that kind of what that manifests into. We did a little bit of a test in terms of like AI written content versus human written content, and I think we all know where the results kind of landed, and human written content was the one that won every single time. But I'm really curious to see how that would change when it's AI written content by Google, because we all know that they're naturally going to push their own incentives or their own initiatives further. So I'm really kind of curious to see how much more they're going to push the AI written content over human written, and then what those effects are going to look like. Because like
sure.
on our end, it was like human written content kicked AI's butt. Like there was no question about it. So I'm really curious to see how that'll play out within the platform, but then also what the generative AI images are going to look like. Like that's something that I haven't really fully taken the time to understand yet. So there's a lot happening in 2024 that I'm very excited about and also terrified for. So
yeah. My theory on some of the AI generated textual content in particular is that when a human is writing the content, the human writes the best content for sort of the average audience, right? Where it'll be interesting to see once it's inside the Performance Max style black box is Google knows a whole lot more about the individual at a segment level than
Mhm.
they'll ever let get transmitted out into the ecosystem at large, right?
Yeah.
So it could hypothetically start to tune that content to the age, to the location, to do they have a cat or a dog, do they have children or not, right? And it could be done in a way that protects privacy because it's all done within their sort of internal sandbox, right? But and it could potentially work better, not as a result of it actually being better written, but better tuned to the segments, right? And they're never going to let the segment information out. So it only works within the walled garden, which gives them a huge advantage because they know a whole lot about the individuals in aggregate and at the individual level. And if they can find a way to protect privacy and delight the individual with better ad copy, well, then that's probably a win, right? It's
Mhm.
just for those of us marketers who are used to being able to say, well, I have a particular persona of a customer that I'd like to be able to write custom content for, but all the various deconstruction of the system has no longer allowed me to find that person based on behavior, so I only have context left, right? So I like within the DSPs and programmatic and other areas of targeting. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes. So we'll certainly have to watch it together over this next year.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, it's really interesting. I just like I'm constantly just every time somebody asks me what we're looking forward to, and I'm like, I don't know where it stops and I don't know where it begins anymore. Like it's just everything. I'm very excited about everything. I want to see what everything happens because there's just so much going on now, and especially with AI taking off the way that it has this year. I'm really curious as to how much further they're going to adopt it and how much further they're going to keep on pushing it. But then also at what point does it like start to, kind of, it doesn't have the effect that we're looking for? When do we start seeing that downturn where we're like, no, human intervention needs to come in now? I'm kind of just really curious to see how that works out because a lot of people obviously are scared that like AI is going to replace us, and that's a big conversation that every industry has been having. And time and time again, even in the run or the test that we ran, like it's very evident we need humans intervening in some way at some point. Humans are the only people that can input that information into Google as well with that data, for Performance Max especially, and especially with the generative AI, we have to sit there and tell them who the audience is. They're not going to be able to figure that out. So it's almost like this like little light at the end of the tunnel, but also like it's a very dark tunnel that you're just like, oh gosh, what's going to happen to me while I try to get to the other end of it. So yeah, it'll be an exciting. I think 2024 is probably going to be one of the most exciting years for digital marketing as a whole, just because we have AI coming into everything, and we've never had that ever happen before.
For sure. Well, thanks so much for joining me, Ameet. It was a pleasure chatting.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in The Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.